"There's no dinner tonight, Dad," my son Garrett told me over the phone, his voice sounding rushed and distant like he had somewhere more important to be. But when I showed up at his house an hour later with homemade chicken soup for his cold, I found them hosting a dinner party, using my secret family recipe and claiming it as their own creation. I stood there in that doorway, holding my soup pot like a fool, watching my daughter-in-law film herself presenting my grandmother's Sunday pot roast to her Instagram followers as Bryn's family tradition. If you've ever had someone steal something precious from you and parade it around like it was always theirs, if you've ever felt the gut punch of betrayal served up with a smile and a camera flash, then pull up a chair and stay a while. Because what I witnessed that night changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and the recipes we passed down through generations. I'm Teddy, and this is the story of how a lie about dinner became the beginning of my greatest culinary comeback. The smell hit me first, that familiar aroma of beef braised in red wine with my secret blend of herbs that I'd been perfecting for 40 years. It was my recipe, down to the last bay leaf and the splash of brandy I added at the end. But there was Bryn, standing in front of a professionally lit setup in Garrett's dining room, telling her audience about how this was a treasured family recipe passed down from my great-grandmother in the old country. My hands were shaking as I watched her describe techniques I'd taught her myself. Watched her smile, that perfect influencer smile, while she butchered the pronunciation of ingredients I'd spent decades learning to balance. The dining room was full of young couples I'd never seen before, all nodding appreciatively as they tasted my life's work and complimented Bryn on her amazing culinary heritage. Garrett stood behind the camera, beaming with pride at his wife's performance, looking like he'd completely forgotten that this was the same recipe he'd grown up eating every Sunday at my table. The same recipe his mother Grace had helped me perfect during 37 years of marriage. The same recipe that had been in my family since my Italian great-grandmother brought it to Ellis Island in 1923. But here's the thing about being a chef for 35 years. You learn that the most important ingredient in any dish isn't something you can buy at the grocery store. It's respect. Respect for the tradition, respect for the people who taught you, and respect for the stories that make each recipe sacred. And watching my own son let his wife steal and monetize those stories. Well, let's just say that was a recipe for something much more complex than pot roast. If you're someone who believes that some things in life are too precious to be stolen and repackaged for social media fame, if you think that family recipes deserve better than being turned into content for strangers, then stick around, because what happened next proved that sometimes the best revenge is served at exactly the right temperature, with perfect seasoning and a side of poetic justice. I backed away from that doorway quietly, still holding my soup pot, and walked back to my car with a plan already forming in my mind. 40 years of professional kitchen experience had taught me that when someone serves you disrespect, the best response is to show them what real cooking looks like, and I was about to give them a masterclass they'd never forget. If you're enjoying this story about standing up for family traditions and the recipes that bind us together, go ahead and subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries. I've got plenty more tales about the intersection of food, family, and the kind of betrayal that can only be properly seasoned with justice. Cooking wasn't just my profession, it was my love language, my way of showing care when words felt inadequate. I started working in restaurant kitchens when I was 16, washing dishes and peeling potatoes for old Italian chefs who taught me that every ingredient had a story and every dish was a conversation between the cook and the person eating it. By the time I was 25, I was running the line at Romano's, the best family restaurant in our part of the city. Grace used to joke that she fell in love with me through my cooking before she ever really saw my face. She'd come into Romano's every Tuesday night with her girlfriends, and I'd send out little extras from the kitchen, a perfectly seasoned bruschetta, a sample of whatever sauce I was experimenting with, a dessert that wasn't on the menu but that I thought she might like. Our entire courtship happened through food, with me pouring my heart into every plate I sent to her table. When Garrett was little, our kitchen was the heart of our home in ways that went far beyond just preparing meals. He'd stand on a wooden step stool next to me, his tiny hands helping to stir sauces and knead bread dough, while Grace sat at the kitchen table grading papers from her teaching job. Sunday dinner wasn't just about eating. It was about the 3 hours we spent together preparing the meal, talking about our weeks, and building the kind of memories that should last a lifetime. The Sunday pot roast recipe had been passed down through 4 generations of my family, each cook adding their own small improvements while keeping the soul of the dish intact. My great-grandmother, Nonna Rosa, brought it from the hills of Tuscany. My grandmother added the wine reduction technique she learned from a French chef during the war, and my mother perfected the herb blend that made people close their eyes in bliss when they took the first bite. I spent years teaching that recipe to Grace, showing her how to brown the meat properly, how to build layers of flavor, how to know when the vegetables were perfectly tender without being mushy. After she mastered it, we started experimenting together, adding our own touches. A splash of balsamic vinegar, a secret spice blend I'd developed during my years at Romano's, techniques I'd learned from other chefs who'd become like family to me. When I finally opened my own restaurant, Teddy's Table, that pot roast became our signature Sunday dish. Food critics from 3 counties would drive out just to taste it, and I'd watch families gather around tables in my dining room, sharing the same kind of love and connection that Grace, Garrett, and I had built in our own kitchen. The recipe wasn't just food, it was a legacy, a bridge between generations, a way of saying, this is who we are and where we come from. After Grace passed away from cancer 5 years ago, I closed the restaurant because cooking for strangers felt empty when I could no longer cook for the person who mattered most. But I kept making that pot roast for Garrett and his new wife, hoping to pass on not just the recipe, but the love and tradition it represented. I thought I was building a bridge to the next generation of our family. I had no idea I was actually just providing content for someone else's brand. The first time Bryn asked me to teach her the pot roast recipe, I was thrilled. She and Garrett had been married for 2 years, and she'd always seemed politely uninterested in my cooking, picking at her food during family dinners and usually having some dietary restriction that meant she couldn't really enjoy what I'd prepared. But that day, she came to my apartment with a notebook and a smile, saying she wanted to learn to make Garrett's favorite dish. We spent 4 hours in my little kitchen, and I taught her everything. The importance of searing the meat at high heat to lock in the juices, the specific order for adding the vegetables so they'd cook evenly, the way my grandmother had shown me to tie the herbs into a bundle so they could be easily removed before serving. Bryn took careful notes, asked thoughtful questions, and even tasted and adjusted the seasoning like a real cook, learning a craft. She filmed parts of our cooking session on her phone, saying she wanted to remember the techniques for later. I was touched that she was documenting our family tradition, thinking maybe this was the beginning of a real relationship between us. "This is such a special recipe, Teddy," she said, giving me a hug as she left with containers full of pot roast. "I can't wait to surprise Garrett with it next weekend." The surprise dinner she made for Garrett was apparently a huge success, and he called me the next day, raving about how perfectly she'd executed the recipe. "Dad, it tasted exactly like yours," he said, his voice full of pride in his wife's cooking abilities. "She's got real talent in the kitchen." I felt proud too, thinking I'd successfully passed on another piece of our family's culinary heritage. Over the next few months, Bryn started asking me to teach her other family recipes. My mother's marinara sauce, Grace's famous apple pie, even the tricky risotto technique I'd learned from a chef in Milan during the one vacation Grace and I had taken to Europe. Each time, she'd arrive with her notebook and her phone, carefully documenting every step and asking questions that made me think she was genuinely passionate about cooking. What I didn't realize was that she was also building a social media presence around her cooking expertise, posting pictures of the dishes we'd made together with captions about her natural talent and intuitive understanding of flavors. She never mentioned that she was learning these recipes from someone else, never credited the generations of family cooks who'd perfected these techniques over decades of practice and love. The first red flag should have been when Garrett stopped asking me to cook for their dinner parties. "Bryn's really gotten into cooking," he'd explain when I offered to bring something. "She wants to handle everything herself now." I was happy that she'd found a passion, proud that my teaching had inspired her to explore the culinary arts. I thought I was watching a daughter-in-law discover her calling. I had no idea I was actually watching someone prepare to erase me from my own family story. The phone call that started it all came on a Thursday evening while I was reading in my armchair, enjoying the quiet of my small apartment and planning the grocery list for my weekend cooking. Garrett's voice sounded stuffy when he called, and he kept clearing his throat like he was fighting off a cold. "Hey, Dad, I hate to cancel on you, but there's no dinner this weekend," he said, sounding genuinely apologetic. "Bryn's swamped with work stuff, and I'm feeling pretty rough. Maybe we can reschedule for next week." I could hear congestion in his voice, and that parental instinct that never really goes away kicked into high gear. After we hung up, I spent an hour in my kitchen making a big pot of the chicken and rice soup that had always been my go-to remedy whenever Garrett was sick as a child. Grace used to say that soup made with love was better than any medicine, and I'd watched that theory prove itself true countless times over the years. The drive to Garrett's house took me through the neighborhood where Grace and I had raised him, past the elementary school where she'd taught for 20 years, past the park where we'd had countless family picnics. I was feeling nostalgic and nurturing, looking forward to surprising my sick son with comfort food and maybe staying to keep him company for a while. The soup pot was still warm on the passenger seat when I pulled into his driveway. That's when I noticed all the cars parked along the street in front of their house. Expensive cars, the kind that young professionals drive to impress each other, lined up like they were attending some kind of event. Through the large front windows, I could see lights and movement, hear the sound of laughter and conversation. My first thought was confusion. Maybe Garrett was feeling better and they decided to have people over after all. I rang the doorbell, balancing the soup pot in my arms, and expecting to see my son's surprised but grateful face when he opened the door. Instead, a young man I'd never seen before answered, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and holding a wine glass. "Oh, are you here for Bryn's cooking demonstration?" he asked, looking me up and down with the kind of polite confusion reserved for uninvited guests. Before I could answer, I heard Bryn's voice projecting from the dining room, speaking in the bright, performative tone she used for her social media content. Now, the secret to this recipe is in the browning technique. You have to get that perfect caramelization on the meat before you add any liquid. This is a family recipe that's been passed down through generations, and the key is patience and understanding the way the flavors build on each other. I walked toward that voice like I was sleepwalking, carrying my soup pot through a house that suddenly felt like foreign territory. The dining room had been transformed into a professional filming setup, with ring lights and cameras positioned to capture every angle of Bryn's performance. She was standing behind a beautifully plated Sunday pot roast, my Sunday pot roast, explaining to a room full of food bloggers and influencers how this was a treasured family tradition that she'd learned from her Italian great-grandmother's handwritten recipe. The smell, the presentation, even the garnish of fresh herbs scattered around the platter. Everything was exactly as I'd taught her, down to the smallest detail. But as I stood there in the doorway, listening to her describe my family's legacy as her own inheritance, I felt something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with betrayal served at the perfect temperature. I stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching my daughter-in-law present my life's work to a room full of strangers who hung on every word of her fabricated family history. She was describing the technique for deglazing the pan, the same technique my grandmother had taught my mother, who'd taught me, who'd taught Grace, who'd helped me perfect it over decades of Sunday dinners, as if she'd discovered it through her own culinary intuition. The audience was completely captivated, taking notes and photos as Bryn explained her natural understanding of traditional cooking methods and her deep connection to old-world flavors. One food blogger asked about the specific herbs in the seasoning blend, and I watched Bryn smile mysteriously and say, "That's a family secret that's been passed down orally for generations. Some things you just feel in your bones, you know." That's when I spotted Garrett standing behind one of the cameras, beaming with pride as his wife performed for her audience. He was holding his phone, presumably recording additional content, looking completely healthy despite the cold he'd claimed to have just hours earlier. When he saw me standing there with my soup pot, his face went white, but instead of acknowledging me or explaining the situation, he just turned away and pretended he hadn't noticed his father's arrival. One of the guests noticed me then, an older woman with silver hair who looked like she might actually know something about cooking. "Excuse me," she said, looking at the soup pot in my arms. "Are you here to help with the demonstration?" The question was innocent enough, but it made the entire room turn to look at me, including Bryn, whose confident smile faltered for just a moment when she realized her father-in-law was standing there with evidence of the lie she'd told about dinner being cancelled. "Oh, Teddy," Bryn said, recovering quickly and speaking in the overly bright tone she used when she was trying to control a situation. "What a surprise! Everyone, this is my father-in-law. He was just dropping something off." She moved toward me with her arms outstretched, like she was going to give me a hug, but her eyes were sending a very clear message about not making a scene in front of her audience. I looked at my son, still hoping for some sign of remorse or explanation, but Garrett was suddenly very busy adjusting camera equipment and couldn't seem to meet my eyes. The room full of food influencers and bloggers was staring at me expectantly, probably waiting for me to add some charming family anecdote to Bryn's performance. Instead, I stood there holding my soup pot and realizing that I'd become a stranger in my own family's story. "I brought soup," I said quietly, my voice sounding strange and small in that bright, artificially lit room. "Garrett said he was sick, so I made soup." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched Bryn's face tighten as she processed the implications of what I'd just revealed to her audience. Without another word, I set the soup pot down on their kitchen counter and walked back toward the front door, past the cameras and lights, and the room full of people who were now whispering among themselves about the awkward family drama they'd just witnessed. I didn't say goodbye, didn't make excuses or explanations. I just left my homemade soup, made with the same love and care I'd been pouring into food for my family for 40 years, and walked out of that house knowing that something fundamental had changed between my son and me forever. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, staring at my collection of recipe cards and photo albums, trying to process what I'd witnessed and what it meant for the future of my family relationships. The recipe cards were yellowed with age and stained with decades of use. My grandmother's handwriting in faded blue ink, my mother's notes in the margins, Grace's additions written in her careful teacher's script. These weren't just cooking instructions, they were love letters between generations. On Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done since Grace died. I called my old friend Margot Chen, the chef who'd run the kitchen at the Golden Ladle before opening her own successful restaurant downtown. Margot and I had worked together for years, trading techniques and supporting each other through the brutal world of professional cooking. If anyone would understand what I was feeling, it would be her. "Teddy." Margot's voice was warm with genuine pleasure when she heard from me. "It's been too long, old friend. How are you holding up?" When I told her the whole story, the cancelled dinner, the surprise discovery, the way my family recipes were being monetized and rebranded. She listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy and outrage. "That's not just theft," Margot said when I finished. "That's cultural appropriation of your own family's heritage, and the fact that your son stood by and watched it happen. Teddy, I'm so sorry. But you know what? You taught me something years ago that I've never forgotten. You said that the best chefs aren't the ones who can copy other people's recipes. They're the ones who understand the soul of the dish so deeply that they can make it their own while still honoring its origins." We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of the conversation, I had a plan. It wasn't about revenge, exactly. It was about reclaiming my story and showing the difference between someone who performs cooking for cameras and someone who understands it in their bones. "You know what the food world needs right now?" Margot asked. "Authenticity. Real stories from real cooks who learned their craft through love instead of social media tutorials." That afternoon, I drove to the farmers' market for the first time since Grace died, walking among the vendors and reacquainting myself with the rhythm of selecting ingredients based on quality rather than convenience. The tomatoes were perfect, heavy and fragrant with the kind of deep red color that can't be faked. The herbs were fresh and aromatic, the kind that make you understand why cooking is both art and science. I spent the evening in my kitchen, not following any recipe, but letting my hands remember techniques I'd learned over 40 years of professional cooking. I made a simple marinara sauce from those perfect tomatoes, seasoned it with herbs and love, and the kind of intuitive understanding that can't be taught through YouTube videos or Instagram tutorials. As the sauce simmered, filling my apartment with the aroma of my childhood, I realized that Bryn could steal my recipes, but she could never steal my knowledge or my connection to the food I'd been cooking all my life. The sauce was perfect. The kind of perfect that comes from understanding not just what to add to a dish, but why and when and how much. It was the kind of perfect that Bryn would never achieve, no matter how many family recipes she appropriated or how many cooking videos she made, because she was performing cooking instead of living it. And that's when I knew exactly how to show the world the difference. The next morning, I called Felix Martinez, a young chef who'd worked at my restaurant during its final years and had always shown genuine respect for traditional cooking methods. Felix was now running his own food truck, but dreaming of opening a real restaurant, and when I explained what I wanted to do, he was immediately on board. "Chef Teddy," he said, using the title he'd always insisted on even after I retired, "it would be an honor to help you tell your real story." We spent the weekend filming what we decided to call Sunday Supper with Chef Teddy. A simple, honest cooking show filmed in my apartment kitchen with Felix holding a basic camera and asking genuine questions about techniques, family history, and the stories behind each dish. There were no professional lights, no perfectly staged ingredients, just an old chef sharing knowledge that had been earned through decades of practice and love. The first episode featured my Sunday pot roast, but instead of just demonstrating the recipe, I told its real story, starting with my great-grandmother Rosa, who brought it from Tuscany with nothing but the clothes on her back and a head full of recipes that would feed her family through the Great Depression. I showed viewers the original recipe card, written in Rosa's careful Italian script, and explained how each generation had added their own touch while respecting the foundation she'd laid. "Real cooking isn't about performing for cameras," I said, looking directly into Felix's simple setup. "It's about understanding your ingredients, respecting the people who taught you, and putting love into every step of the process. When you steal someone else's family recipe and claim it as your own, you're not just taking their intellectual property, you're erasing their history, their heritage, and the love that made that recipe worth passing down in the first place." Felix posted the video on his social media channels with a simple caption, "Learning from a master chef who understands that food is about family, tradition, and respect." Within hours, the video had thousands of views and hundreds of comments from people who recognized authenticity when they saw it. Food bloggers and restaurant critics began sharing it, praising the honesty and depth of knowledge that couldn't be faked or manufactured. But the real victory came when Margot called me 3 days later, laughing so hard she could barely speak. "Teddy, you have to see this," she said. "Someone tagged Bryn in the comments of your video, asking if she'd learned her pot roast recipe from you. The whole thing is unraveling. People are comparing your video to hers, pointing out that your family history is documented and real, while hers is obviously fabricated. Her follower count is dropping by the thousands." The final twist came when Garrett called me a week later. His voice small and ashamed in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child caught in a lie. "Dad," he said, "I need to apologize. I need to explain. Bryn convinced me that you wouldn't mind, that sharing family recipes was just, I don't know, I wasn't thinking straight. But watching your video, seeing the comments from people who understand what real cooking means, I realized what we did to you." I listened to his apology, appreciated his recognition of the harm that had been done, and accepted his request to start rebuilding our relationship. But I also made it clear that some things couldn't be undone, and that trust, like a good sauce, takes time to develop properly and can be ruined in an instant if you don't treat it with the respect it deserves. These days, I'm busier than I've been since Grace died. Sunday Supper with Chef Teddy has become a regular series, with Felix and I exploring different family recipes and the stories behind them. We've had other older chefs on as guests, sharing their own family traditions and the knowledge that can't be learned from social media tutorials. Young cooks reach out asking for advice, and I'm teaching again, really teaching, not just providing content for someone else's brand. The best part is that I'm cooking with purpose again, sharing not just recipes, but the love, history, and respect that make food into something more than just fuel for our bodies. Bryn can keep her ring lights and her fabricated stories, but she'll never have what I have. The deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that when you teach someone to cook, you're passing on love in its most essential form. If you've made it this far in my story, you understand that some things in life are too precious to be stolen and repackaged for profit. Family recipes aren't just instructions. They're love letters between generations, and they deserve to be treated with the reverence they've earned. Drop a comment below and tell me about a family recipe that means something special to you. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries for more stories about the intersection of food, family, and the kind of authenticity that can't be manufactured in a ring-lit kitchen. Until next time, remember that the most important ingredient in any dish is the story behind it, and the best stories are always true.